logs to make small circles, where they sat, while their companions stirred and fried. The Crown Prince's dogs, who had dutifully trotted alongside their master, approached the assassin with wagging tails and lay at her feet. At least someone was glad for her company. Hungry by the time a plate was finally laid in her lap, Selena became a bit more irritated when the captain did not immediately remove her irons. After giving her a long warning look, he unlocked her chains and clamped them onto her ankles. She only rolled her eyes as she raised a small portion of meat to her lips. She chewed slowly. One last thing she needed was to be sick in front of them. While the soldiers talked amongst themselves, Selena took in her surroundings. She and Gale sat with 5 soldiers. The Crown Prince, of course, sat with Barrington on their own 2 logs far from her. While Dorian had been all arrogance and amusement the previous night, his features were grave as he spoke to the Duke. His entire body seemed tense, and she didn't fail to notice the way he clenched his jaw when Barrington spoke. Whatever the relationship was, it wasn't cordial. Mid-bite, Selena tore her focus from the prince to study the trees. The forest had gone silent. The ebony hound's ears were erect, though they didn't seem to be bothered by the stillness. Even the soldiers quieted. Her heart skipped a beat. The forest was different here. The leaves dangled like jewels, tiny droplets of ruby, pearl, topaz, amethyst, emerald and garnet, and a carpet of such riches coated the forest floor around them. Despite the ravages of conquest, this part of oak-walled forest remained untouched. It still echoed with the remnants of power that had once given these trees such unnatural beauty. She'd only been aid to an Arabin Hamel. Her mentor and the king of assassins found her half submerged in the banks of a frozen river and brought her to his keep and the border between Adalin and Terrasen. While training her to be his finest and most loyal assassin, Arabin, I think it's Arabin, or is it Arabine? I'm not sure. I say Arabin in my head. Arabin had never allowed her to return home to Terrasen. Again, Terrasen. I'm not sure. We'll stick with Terrasen. But she still remembered the beauty of the world before the king of Adalin had ordered so much of it burned. Now there was nothing left for her there, nor would there ever be. Arabin had never said it aloud, but if she refused his offer to train her, he would have handed her to those who would have killed her, or worse. She'd been newly orphaned, and even at 8 she knew that her life with Arabin, with a new name that no one would ever recognise but someday everyone would fear, was a chance to start over, to escape the fate that led her to leap into the icy river that night 10 years ago. Damned forest, said an olive-skinned soldier in the circle. A soldier beside him chuckled. The sooner it's burned, the better, I say. The other soldiers nodded, and Selena stiffened. It's full of hate, said another. Did you expect anything else? She interrupted. Gale's hand darted to his sword as the soldiers turned to her, and some of them sneering. This isn't just any forest, she beckoned with her fork to the woods. It's Brannan's forest. My father used to tell me stories about it being full of fairies, a soldier said. They're all gone now. One took a bite of an apple and said, along with those damned wretched fae. Another said, we got rid of them, didn't we? I'd watch your tongue, Selena snapped. King Brannan was fae, and Oakwold is still his. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the trees remembered him. The soldiers laughed. They'd have to be 2,000 years. I can't get it out. tears as she watched the forest pass, the tightness in her neck not easing until they had left the shimmering glen far behind. Her body ached by the time they'd stopped for the night. She didn't bother to speak at dinner, nor to care when a small tent was erected. Guards posted outside, and she was allowed to sleep, still shackled to one of them. She didn't dream, but when she awoke, she couldn't believe her eyes. Small suspicions